All right, my goal today is to just give you a brief overview of some of the different areas of the cortex that we're interested in looking at. As we discussed in class, it's important to recognize that there's still a lot of research about the brain that we don't understand. For that reason, we can't dive so much into the molecular as we would otherwise do with other systems. We still have to rely on an anatomy-based approach. We know that if we perturb this region, this is going to happen kind of thing. And even with that, it's complicated. There's so much interplay between all these regions. It's really kind of hard to parse out this specific region does this specific region does that. It doesn't work like that. You add on top of that individual differences and the plasticity of the brain, and it gets to be a challenge. But we can make some gross generalizations, as you see here in this picture of the brain, that will hopefully allow us moving forward to at least anatomically be talking about the same structures as we think about certain processes. So with that in mind, what I would like to do is briefly talk about the cerebrum. That's what we have pictured up here. It can, of course, be divided into left and right sides. The differences, I think, are not as broad as anticipated earlier, but there certainly are some differences. We know that the right side tends to be associated more with spatial skills and recognition. Of course, the left side a little bit more with maybe things like symbols or math, but really this isn't that big of a deal. However, there are some distinct differences between the left and the right sides that we want to talk about. Okay, I'd like to divide the cerebrum up into, let's do it by color. Let's go with white, and let's go with gray. As we think about white, of course, white is myelinated. And when we're talking about myelinated neurons, we're talking about axons, of course. So this is made up of tracts. And as we mentioned, a neuron or a bundle of neurons in the peripheral nervous system is called a nerve. A bundle of neurons in the central nervous system is called a tract. And we can actually divide this up into three different types. We've got what are called projection tracts, commissural tracts, and association tracts. And the names help us understand where these are projecting or associating with or to. So if we're talking about projection tracts, the easiest way to think about projection is communication with the brain and the body. Commissural tracts, this is communication between the left brain and the right brain. And association tracts, communication that stays on the same side. So left to left and right to right. All right, with that in mind, let's go now look at the gray matter. The gray matter is a little bit more interesting. This is unmyelinated. We're also going to make a division here. We're going to talk about the cortex. This is the outer layer of the brain. And we're going to throw in an introduction to the basal nuclei, some of my favorite structures. These are going to be involved in posture, body movement, execution of motor programs, that sort of thing. Let's zoom out for just a minute. And I want to revisit this picture here of the cortex and the different areas associated with certain behaviors or sensations. I've divided that up into 4 basic lobes. We can see this down here. And I'd like just for a minute to talk about some of the characteristics of these lobes individually. We have the frontal lobe. And things that I want you to associate with the frontal lobe include executive reasoning and also personality. Some different areas would be Broca's area And we're simply going to associate this with motor speech. In other words, the ability to form words with your mouth so that you can speak properly. Recognize this is actually typically found only on the left side of the brain. I think that's interesting. As we think about coordinating muscle movement, we see here in the prefrontal cortex planning that takes place, which would go then to the premotor cortex, which would then execute that plan by delivering that to the motor cortex. This is where you would expect to find the origins or the cell bodies of your upper motor neurons, for the most part. Let's provide a few other landmarks that we can look at to help us divide these. This right here is called the central sulcus. Of course, we know that the sulcus is the groove, the gyrus is the mountain, if you will. And this region, this primary motor cortex, is the precentral gyrus. I am going to draw kind of a little upside down man right here. That is reference to this guy. This is a motor homunculus. It's a three-dimensional representation of the amount of surface area imparted by the brain to those organs. And if you look, it's obvious to see that areas where fine-tuning motor coordination is required are greatly enlarged. You see this specifically in the hands and also the lips. There's a tremendous amount of surface area of the brain required to drive the hands and the fine-tuning and the coordination that we get from our hands. Also, the mouth, being able to speak, being able to move your lips in a certain way that allows for speech. There's a lot of brain surface area that goes to help driving that. Let's now go on to the second structure out here, the parietal lobe. We have here the post-central gyrus, and this is all about sensory. Likewise, I would expect to see homunculus here in the sensory part of the gyrus because of very similarly an exaggeration of the lips, of the hands. These are areas that receive a lot of input. Other structures would include down here somewhere in this area, Wernicke's area. I'd like to associate that with sensory speech in a similar way to Broca's area down in the frontal cortex. This also tends to be on the left side of the brain. And importantly, this is required it's right next to the temporal lobe, as we'll see in a minute. This is going to be associated with hearing. This is where the brain makes sense of words being audibly spoken. Let's look now at the occipital lobe. This is all about vision. And then the temporal lobe. And this is about hearing. I would at this time like to just make a mention, very similar to how we went through the different areas of the frontal cortex. It's important to recognize there's a primary cortex and then there's what we call an association cortex. And I would just like to bring that back over here. We talked about these association tracts. These don't cross, but they help communicate areas on the same side of the brain. For example, for sensory, I've got a primary cortex, and this would allow me to reach a hand blindly into a bag and feel what's in there. And I might feel something that's round, that has a certain texture to it, a certain pattern associated with it. But then that information will be relayed to an association area that would tell me, oh, it's a baseball. And then I think about baseball and how to play baseball. That's what I associate that texture and size with. And it's the same for all of these others. I have in the occipital lobe, I have a primary lobe, and I have an association cortex. It's the same with the hearing. I'll hear a sound, but then I'll associate with maybe a certain genre of music. That's how this tends to work. Last but not least, let's label that fissure right there, not a fissure, what we call the lateral sulcus. If I was to take an instrument that could go in and pry these two layers apart, then what I would see right here would be the insular cortex, or commonly called the insula, and this is my primary gustation area or taste.